Okay, this week's Parshas Eikev. What I would like to do is read some of the psukim, just in a row, and translate them, and then go through a few of them and discuss, and we'll see that there's one message that's going to come out, and then I would like to share a piece with you from the Stipler. Discuss that later. So if you want to follow along, page 985, 984 in the Hebrew. Actually, no, that's a lie. 982. I'm going to start with Pasuk Yud, verse 10. It says like this. Va'achalta, also, the verses might seem that they don't have any connection, but we're going to see that they do have a connection. The first verse and the rest of it. Va'achalta v'savata uberachta. You shall eat, you shall be satiated, and you shall bless. Es Hashem Elokecha, the Lord your God, al ha'aretz hatova asher nasan lach. On the good land which Hashem gave to you. Hishamar lacha. Be careful, pen tishkach es Hashem Elokecha, lest you forget Hashem your God. Levil tishamar mitzvosav, that you don't follow His commandments, mishpatav v'chukosav, and His statutes, asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, which I command you today. Pen taichal v'savata, ubatim tovim tivnei v'shavta. Dennis.
Yeah, I'll be right there.
There's some food in there if you want.
All right, thank you.
Lest you become satiated, you live in your big houses, and you forget Hashem. You'll have a lot of animals. You'll have a lot of money, gold and silver. Everything you'll have a lot of. You'll become haughty. And you'll forget Hashem your God, who took you out of Egypt from the house of servitude. That He leads you through the great desert, and the wondrous desert, that He protects you from the snakes and the scorpions and the serpents, and gives you water so that you're not thirsty. He fed you manna in the desert, which your fathers did not know. In order to oppress you, in order to test you, to do good in the end, in your end. And you'll say in your heart, it's through my own strength that I became wealthy. Remember, it's Hashem who gives you strength to make wealth. In order to establish His covenant, that He swore to your forefathers on this day. If you forget Hashem your God and go after other gods, and serve them, and bow to them, you will be lost. Just like Hashem will cause the nations in front of you to be lost, so too you will be lost. If you don't listen to the word of Hashem your God. So we start here, just summarize what we just read. That says you shall eat, you shall be satisfied, and you should bless. That's the mitzvah we have to bench. Whenever we have bread, there is, if you ate a kazayas, a certain eggs volume of bread, and you're full, eating a meal, there's a Torah commandment to bench. Then it says, make sure not to forget Hashem. Don't, if you become wealthy, specifically don't forget Hashem. And it says that don't worship idols. Okay, so what does that have to do with everything? So let's start from the beginning. Not from the beginning. I'm going to start from the middle. So, the general idea, obviously, here, is that when a person becomes wealthy, and he's very comfortable, and he wants for nothing, it is very easy to forget Hashem. That is a very difficult test. People like religion when they're poor, and they are in dire straits, so they need to call out to God. But very often what happens is, when they become successful, and everything's going well, they forget about Hashem. They forget about God. Right? Look at the Jewish experience in America. When they were poor, living in the Lower East Side, they're very religious, but now the Jewish people in general are much more affluent, and much of the Jewish people have forgotten Hashem, have forgotten the Torah. It's actually interesting, I saw a report that the Catholic Church, the only place it's growing is in South America, in different third world countries. But in the first world countries, people don't need it. People forget God when everything is going well. Now, this relates to, what is the test of the manna? The man. It says, right, why was it a test? If we read the pasuk, he says, Hashem sends you man. That was the miraculous food that came down from heaven when the Jewish people were in the desert every day for 40 years. And the verse here says it was a test. What was the test? So there are different interpretations of exactly what the test was when the manna came down. But the Sforno says, I saw this quoted by Rabbi Franz. The Sforno says, the test was, will the Jewish people still serve Hashem when they don't have to worry about their livelihood? When you have to work for a living, so people tend to rely on Hashem because they have to work and they want to make sure they're successful, so they pray and they want to make sure it goes well. But let's say everything would be provided for you. How would you spend your day? You don't have to work, money grows on the tree, you don't have to do anything. How would a human being spend their day? So many people, probably most people, would end up wasting their lives and doing not such great things. In fact, the Chovos Halevavos, which was a book written in the Middle Ages, very foundational sefer of Jewish Musar, Jewish ethical teaching, says one of the reasons that human beings have to work for a living is so that they don't have too much free time that they would get into trouble. Very few people, if they had free time and didn't have to work for a living, would actually spend their day studying Torah and doing mitzvahs and getting close to Hashem. Many people would spend the whole day at the beach and getting themselves into trouble, doing sins, and doing other things. So the test of the manna was, Jewish people, for 40 years in the desert, I'm giving you your livelihood. I'm giving you food. You don't have to do anything. How are you going to spend the time? Are you going to study Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu and try to get closer to Hashem? Or are you going to waste your time? Now, when a person has everything he needs, and he's affluent, and he's very wealthy, like we mentioned, that causes someone to forget Hashem. It's very easy to forget Hashem. You don't need Hashem. Everything is provided for you. You can just spend your day however you want. What do you need God for? In fact, the Mesilas Yesharim says this is one of the tests of life. We tend to think that it's a test to be poor, right? Because we grew up with Fiddler on the Roof. We grew up with Tevye, complaining that he was very poor and it was very hard to serve God, and he wanted to be a rich man. If he only was a rich man, then he would be able to serve Hashem. He could sit in the Eastern Wall. He would sit in the synagogue and pray. Right? But we tend to think that it's only a test of one's faith if he's poor and he doesn't have his needs met. It's very hard to keep the Torah. How do you expect me to daven and study Torah? I have to work 23 hours every day just to make a living. So that's a test. We can understand that test. But there's a test of being wealthy also. The Mesilas Yesharim, which is if you haven't learned it, you have to learn it. The Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just. And if you learned it once, you have to learn it again. If you learned it twice, you have to learn it again. In fact, he writes in the beginning of the book that he says, I'm not writing this book because there are things that you don't know. I'm writing this book because you need to read it again and again and again to get it into you, get the messages into you. So I want to read a selection here. He says, V'nimtza, shu musim be'emes b'toich ha-milchama ha-chazaka. A person is put in a great battle. Ki kol inyanei ha'olam, ben l'tov, ben l'ra, hinehem nisyonis la'adam. Things in the world, whether they're good or bad, are a test for people. Ha'oni mitzad echad, poverty on one hand, va'osher mitzad echad, and wealth on the other hand. Inyan Shamar Shlomo, like King Solomon says, maybe you'll become wealthy and you'll say, who is God? Or maybe you'll become poor and then you'll steal. So there's a test on each way. On one hand, a person becomes wealthy, and just like we read in these verses here, you're very wealthy and everything is handed to you. What do you need God for? So you forget Hashem. But on the other hand, if you're poor, also is a test, because maybe you'll be tempted to steal. If you're able to be victorious in every area, then he'll be a complete person. Then he'll go out of this hallway of this world and go into the palace of the world to come. Okay. So that's one thing. That was the first group of the psukim. Now when a person's wealthy, he tends to forget Hashem. So nowadays, compared to where we live in this time in human history, we are all affluent compared to the way our ancestors lived. And it's a very, very big test. What do we need God for? Right? You just look at the amount of Jewish population in our area and the percentage of Jews that attend synagogue on a regular basis. Right? People don't need God, they think. Right? They're doing very well. They have their money, they have their 3 cars, they have their... until something happens, then they need no atheist in a foxhole. So we see here, many of us unfortunately have failed the test. And not only people that don't observe, but whatever level we're at, there's an element within ourselves that we think, what do we need Hashem? I'm the one who's in charge. I'm powerful. I don't need God. That's the next verse. It says, Kochi ve'otzim yadi. Don't say that it's through my power, my strength that I was successful. It's through Hashem. It's through Hashem that I'm successful, not through my own strength. That's the Yetzer Hara we have. Even the most religious person has that Yetzer Hara. To say, oh, I was successful because I put in the effort. No. Hashem wanted you to be successful. You had to put in the effort, but it's not because of you. It's because Hashem made you successful. Now I want to read a very beautiful Orach Chaim, which I saw quoted by Rabbi Gedalia Shor. So he says here, Perush. So tzarich lati libo tavoso ki me'Hashem haislo. A person, it says here, v'zacharta, as Hashem elokecha ki hu anosin l'chakoch. Yeah, the verse we read says, remember, it's Hashem who gives you strength. A person has to remember that. Remember that it's Hashem who gives you strength. Why? Shetzarich lati libo al tavoso. A person has to contemplate the goodness, that the goodness in the world is from Hashem. And what this happens, right, and he has to constantly remember the goodness that God gives him and the divine providence in his life. Utchilas tachbulos of Yetzer ha'adam, the first thing that the evil inclination tries to do to us, la'ashkicho davar zeh, is to try to get us to forget the goodness that God does for us. V'derech zeh yikanis la'abdo. V'ulai ki lezeh samach maimer she'achrei zeh, v'hayim shechach tishkat, perish im shechach davar zeh sha'ayuv. He says, the first thing the Yetzer Hara tries to do to get a person to leave the path of following God is to get him to forget little things first. Forget the goodness that God gave to him. Once a person forgets the goodness that God gave to him, then he'll totally forget Hashem. That's why he says, what's the verse right after that? Right after it says, remember the Hashem is who gives you strength. Remember God's goodness. What's the verse right after? If you forget God and you go after other gods, you literally worship idols. How does it start? It starts by not appreciating from Hashem the goodness that He gives us. What does it lead to? Total idolatry. Literally bowing down to idols and forsaking Hashem totally. Now, I forgot where I saw this, but what was the verse that we started with? This whole paragraph here. It says, "V'achalta v'savatu v'rachta." You shall eat, you shall be satisfied, and you shall bless. Benching. The first thing is to thank Hashem for the food we have. Showing thanks to Hashem. The goodness, appreciating the goodness that God gave to us. When we appreciate, the Orach Chaim concludes, when we appreciate what God gives to us and the goodness that He gives to us, it's a guard for serving Hashem, meaning it protects a person's relationship with Hashem to constantly remember the goodness which God gives to him. And the Kotzker says that, there's a medrash, Abraham, he had guests. He had his famous tent with 4 openings, and all the guests that came in, you know what he would do with them? He would have them bench. He would have them make blessings over the food. You know why? Because when you make blessings over the food, that causes the person to appreciate the goodness that God gives him, and that leads to a greater commitment of serving God in general. So the first step to get close to Hashem and to recognize Hashem is to appreciate God's goodness, and the first step of forgetting Hashem and literally worshiping idols is forgetting that goodness. So I thought what we could do, there's some food in there. Okay. Pepper steak.
Okay, very good.
Steve didn't eat enough.
Okay, we'll leave it to Steve.
So one of the things we're talking, Arnie, this shir is on your famous phrase. It's all from Hashem.
Okay.
We're talking about that the beginning to becoming a servant of Hashem is to appreciate the goodness of Hashem, to appreciate what God gives us. So I have here a book. Unfortunately, I think it's only in Hebrew. I wish they translate in English. It was written by the Steipler. You heard of Rav Chaim Kanievsky? He just passed away. So his father was Rav Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, who was known as the Steipler Gaon. He's a genius. He's one of my Rebbe's Rebbeim, and many stories of him. He had divine inspiration. He got messages directly from Hashem, not literal prophecy, but he got messages from Hashem. and knew things that were supernatural, and he was a huge Torah scholar.
People say get messages from Hashem.
I bet there are holy people that have what's called divine inspiration. God doesn't literally talk to them like a prophecy, but a thought comes in their head that they wouldn't have known. I just heard a story. Rav Steinman, who was neighbors with the Stipler Gaon, actually, there was a boy. This Rabbi Feiner from Far Rockaway brought his son to get a blessing from Rav Steinman, who passed away 104, and Rav Steinman never met him in his life. Never met him, never met his son, but he says, "Oh, Avram Yeshaya, let me give you a bracha." This boy, whose name was Avram Yeshaya, who was named after the Chazon Ish, who was also Rabbi Ben Brak. Rav Steinman knew by looking at the boy that he was named after the Chazon Ish. He saw something in the boy's neshama, something that this boy has a connection to the Chazon Ish. No, and he even asked Rav Steinman's helper. He's like, "I never met him before. How do you know?" He's like, "Did you know my son's name?" Nobody knew his son's name. They couldn't figure it out. Just a little story. So yes, it does happen today by very holy people. So the Stipler wrote a book here called Chaya Olam, and the first chapter of the book is describing. It's called Zikaron Katzas Tovos Habari Yisbarach B'Tzir Z'Adam, to mention a few of the things that God gives to us that we should be thankful for. And he goes through it. So I wanted to learn this together, because we're talking about, again, to be an Eved Hashem, to get close to Hashem. The first thing is to appreciate what God gives us. So he writes here, first of all, that everything that God created, there was nothing that was created for no purpose. Everything was created for a purpose. And now he wants to talk about a little bit of them. He says here, when a person thinks about his body, you see how many great kindnesses that God did for us. When we think about all of our, he's going to go through all of our, every part of our body. And he says, imagine if you couldn't see, God forbid. Imagine how much you'd be lacking in life if you couldn't see. Couldn't see what was going on. That's why the Gemara says that a blind person is like a person who's dead. That's that we have eyelids on our eyes to protect our eyes from dust and things like that. Right? And when we go in the water, we can close our eyes. Right? Imagine if you had eyes but no eyelids. Imagine you couldn't hear. You would be very difficult. You wouldn't be able to talk to people. To have any sociability would be very difficult. The person would become depressed. Now you could taste. You have taste buds. Now imagine if you didn't have taste buds. Not enjoyable it would be to eat. You wouldn't want to eat. You get nothing out of it. You wouldn't want to come to a class and get pepper steak because you couldn't taste it. You might as well be eating wood and chalk. The fact we don't think about it, right? The fact that we have taste buds makes it enjoyable to eat, that we can sustain ourselves.
That was the experience during the 40 years. People in the desert wanted to get.
Oh, right. It could be whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
Right.
People as people who had COVID and don't have taste or smell.
Right. Right. You don't want to eat, and you need to eat to survive. And now we also have a sense of smell. We are able to enjoy good smells. And the fact that we can smell things that are detestable tells us to keep away from certain things, right? Things that are dangerous, a carcass or feces, something like that we can smell. If you couldn't smell, that would be very dangerous. Now how do we live? We have to breathe. So God created a mouth with teeth and with a tongue that we can eat. Not only does our mouth, are we able to eat with our mouth, but we're able to speak with our mouth, that we're able to express what we think. Imagine we couldn't speak. We wouldn't be able to express our inner selves to other people. Not only that, Hashem gave us a voice box that we can have different sounds come out of our voice box, and we can even sing songs. And when you sing songs and have music, that causes a person to be happy. Right? Hashem didn't have to make us like that. We could have just had our voice in a monotone, right? We call Naomi a pleasing voice. We told Shir Ram about only funny ki Ashir Ma'orah Halev Martz Vasmana Yin V'His Orus. Right? Besides being enjoyable to listen to music and listen to a person sing, it causes the person to be inspired. But to Alas Hayadayim, like you said, we have hands. Kama Rabba Shebehem Osa Kol Tzarach. We do everything with our hands. Not only do we have hands, we have fingers. 5 fingers. Kfi Shnos Biyosa L'Chol Melechas Avoda. That we can do everything with our fingers. V'Raglayim L'Halach Behem. And we have feet that we can walk. We have legs that we can walk. Not only that, he says that our legs, if you think about it, they're skinnier on the bottom and they're thicker on top. They're skinnier on the bottom so we can have dexterity. We can move around very easily. We have thousands and thousands of steps every day. If they were too big on the bottom, we wouldn't be able to do that. But then as it gets closer to the body, it gets thicker so we could support ourselves. Right? I was inspired reading this because
we take that for granted.
Right, that's exactly what I was going to say. Everything that he's describing here is obvious, but we never sit and think about it. That's when we sit and think about it, that brings the gratitude to Hashem, and that's the first thing to get to Hashem. And he continues. What time is Mincha, by the way?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock? All right, we got 5 minutes left. Okay. And then not only that, he says we're able to excrete from our bodies the things that we don't need, that our body doesn't need. Waste. We're able to excrete waste. And we have the ability to control when we do that. Imagine we didn't have the ability. People are sick, unfortunately, don't have the ability to control that, but normal people can control when they excrete waste. Imagine how difficult life would be if you had no control over that. Okay. Now, he keeps going. Now, then you have a heart, and you have lungs, and you have intestines, the small intestines. And then we have bones, and we have flesh, and we have veins, and they all work together, all of these systems, to keep a person alive. We have lungs so that we can take in the air according to what we need. And then we have the intestines that we can take in the food, and then the stomach and the intestines extract the nutrients and provide for our body. And he says also the air, we need so much air to survive. So we have a whole atmosphere, what is it, like a few miles up, where you have air, oxygen, so much oxygen that Hashem provided for us. Okay, and then he goes on and on. He's got we only did like a page. He's got 3 more pages where he literally goes through everything in the human body, everything in the environment, talks about how Hashem made the earth, and we need water to survive. So what did Hashem do? He made little rivers and streams that go around the earth so we could have water, and he made wells and spring water very closely under the surface of the earth so we could have water to sustain ourselves. And he just goes through this paragraph and goes through this chapter to really contemplate all the goodness that Hashem did for us. Because the Orach Chaim is saying when we contemplate and we really think about it, just take 5 minutes to think about everything that we have, our bodies, our environment, right? And that's not even we were talking about earlier that we live in this time in human history that it's the most affluent time that human beings ever lived. And we're free from overt physical anti-Semitism. We have so much freedom here, and we really sit and think and ponder how privileged we are and what Hashem gave to us. That's the first step to becoming a servant of Hashem. And like the Orach Chaim says, but when you don't do that, when a person doesn't show gratitude to Hashem, that will eventually lead him to worship idols. So we just have to sit and think. That's what we take out, just to sit and think. Go and read a biology textbook if you don't have this have the stipling.
Is that from Yaakov Esther?
This is from Rabbi Kanievsky, or the disciple who wrote this book. Okay, thank you for coming. Please take more food.
Esther wrote a book